Welcome to the presentation on pseudo-translation. It's a feature in memoQ, and it basically can tell you what happens to your document after it is translated. It will look something like this. Now let's take a closer look. Pseudo-translation is also called simulated translation, so basically the same thing. And it was created for checking user interfaces of software to make sure that the software products still worked after translation and to see how they behaved. For example, can the user interface show all the characters of the target language? Is the text still visible even if it expands during translation, which we quite often see in software pieces, that text is truncated and we can't read everything that's there. Is the font size right for the target language? If we go from English to German, the font size doesn't really matter that much. But if you go from English into Chinese or Japanese, a 9-point font size might not be enough. You might see a Japanese character as a black blob instead of a real character. So checking that might be useful. Does the software crash because of the translation? That did happen a lot in the olden days. And is everything visible? Or everything translated that's visible to the user on the user interface, and is there anything hard-coded that was not extracted for translation? So that was the idea for the user interfaces of software. That's the result of such a test. So if you find that you only see squares instead of the translated text, then probably the font that you're using cannot show the characters of the target language. Or you find a dialogue and there is some text missing, because in English it was just 2 lines and it fitted. In German it's more text, it needs 3 lines, but there's not the space for 3 lines. And, unfortunately this is from memoQ, so I blocked out the rest so that you don't know where it comes from. There are some places. Now the question is, well, if this is useful for software, is it useful for what we do, not software, so not user interfaces, but documents, InDesign documents, PowerPoint files, things like that. And I really do think it is, because fonts matter too in documents. You have to make sure that the target language is shown correctly in the document. And I've seen lots and lots of InDesign files that after translation, and we'll probably hear more about InDesign in your talk, where the InDesign files after translation just showed squares or question marks, and you had to redo the whole thing or have some designer sit there and for 26 languages now check if the font, the custom defined font of the source language can show any of the characters of the target languages. There's not only translation, we also have to care about the layout of the documents. Sizes of the text boxes, are they big enough to show the translated text? Is text overlapping an image? Is there text moving to another page because of text expansion? The client might say everything that's on page 15 in English needs to be on page 15 in French, in German, and so on, because people have to be able to compare the documents. And then they usually don't leave any space in the source language for the text to expand. I see people nodding, so seems to be a common problem. Changing from left to right languages to right to left languages. Not only the text needs to change, but the whole layout of the page needs to change. Pictures need to move. So that is something you also need to check after translation. This is not something that memoQ can do for you, but it's just for you to see how the document will look like after translation, to see what else needs to be done to that document so that you can plan how long the process will take. Default filters for importing files might need to be adjusted to import things that are on master pages, master slides, or in some other places in the document that usually don't get extracted. Especially for InDesign, I would definitely recommend to run a pseudo-translation if you use the default settings, because there's one checkbox which I would love to have checked by default. That's the line spacing. Because if you don't check that box, the line spacing goes back to the default spacing, and then the document looks totally different than before. And usually you can only see, or that only comes up when you send back the file to the client, because translators don't have InDesign. They can't check. But if you do a pseudo-translation, send it back to the client, say, this is basically what it's going to look like after translation. They can say, oh, the line spacing, you need to take care of that. Custom import filters. That's something that I do a lot, creating filters for XML files, complicated files that have different file formats inside. And here I like to check whether I've extracted everything with pseudo-translation. I'll have an example in just a moment. Documents might contain text that cannot be extracted. So things on images, embedded diagrams where memoQ cannot get at the text, or even linked documents. In Word, you have a linked document to see the content of the document, but it's not going to be extracted for translation because it's just linked. It's not embedded. Just an example, I've played around with some fonts in Word and put them into memoQ, put some Turkish letters in, and I found that there are some fonts that cannot show Turkish characters, for example, and that's good to know. The word doesn't make any sense, it's just, I just tried to find some special characters. Now, in many editing environments like Word, InDesign, all the DTP formats, we have text boxes. And these text boxes, they can have a fixed size, or they can be dynamic. They expand with the amount of text inside. But that's something that the designer sets up when they create the document. A lot of people don't even know that they can do that. Again, going back to InDesign files, where a lot of people don't know that they can do that. In Word, I think text box creation is now set up in such a way that if you create a text box, it's automatically set to dynamic. So it will expand with the text. But here, pseudo-translation can help you to find out whether these text boxes need to be adjusted or not. If you have a text box and you run a pseudo-translation, you can add characters at the beginning and at the end of the segments. And this will show you whether everything is visible in the text box or not. If the text box shows up like this, and you see the beginning characters, but not the last ending character, the dollar symbol in that case, you know something is missing, something is not showing up. So you wouldn't, as a translator, if you have a document like that, you have a huge Word document, you can see 50 text boxes, all of them don't show the expanded text. How much time do you need to add after translation to make these text boxes bigger? That needs to go into your proposal and what you need to do to the file, because this is time you need to spend. For project managers as well, if you have a document like this that goes into 26 languages, would you rather have 26 people expanding text boxes afterwards, or have one person do it in the source language first, changing these text boxes to dynamic, and not having to spend manual work on something that nobody wants to do? So for everybody, pseudo-translation can be helpful. Here is an example of something where memoQ cannot extract the text from something that's created inside of a PowerPoint slide, for example. It's a diagram. It's created inside of PowerPoint with a PowerPoint feature. And we can see that it gets at the heading, but the legend of the diagram, that is something that cannot be extracted. It's too deeply embedded into the slide as that memoQ could extract the text from there. So this is something you need to know. If you have 20 slides like that, and you will have to go inside the PowerPoint manually afterwards and change these words there, that's more time. And that's also words that are not being counted in your word count when you import the file. And there's another one on the master slide. So text that appears on every slide, but not on the slide itself, but on the master slide behind. If that is not extracted for translation, it's not translated, it's not counted, and you'll have to deal with it later on. And you might not even know that if you don't do pseudo-translation. And the client come back afterwards and say, oh, this line was not translated. Yeah, setting up the pseudo-translation, you'll do that in the plugins for the machine translation. There is one that's called the memoQ pseudo-translation plugin, and the configuration lets you do quite a lot of things. So, for example, you can set this character at the beginning and at the end of a segment to show when text expands, is it still fully visible in the translated document. It gives you a small example so that you see how the text will change. Then you can, there is a default pseudo-translation that you can run, or you can say, I want to exchange the characters of the source language with specific characters for my target language. You can use the default that is in here, or you can change it. Then you can do length definitions. So, for example, you could say, I add an indicator for how much longer the sentence is going to be. Usually it's an underscore. That's what you see in the example. And there you have, in that second tab of the dialog, you have a lot of settings. You could say everything that is between 1 and 10 characters long expands by 150%. Everything that's longer expands by only 120%. It depends very much on the languages that you're working with. Because everybody now asks me, okay, where is the standard for these expansions? There are expansion tables. So if you look on the internet and go for text expansion as your search term, you will find a lot. Unfortunately, people seem to be copying from each other a lot. So you will find the same table coming up on hundreds of websites. Not many people really do these tests themselves, but there are some that I've found. And this text expansion or shrinking really depends on the language pair. If I go from English to German, I have a different expansion rate than from English to Japanese, or from German to Japanese, or from Chinese to Portuguese. So it's always different. It depends on the type of text that you have. It depends on the length of the segments that you have. Do you have single word segments or paragraph length segments? So there's a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration, and the best thing is to do the tests yourself and have an idea of what the usual text that you have, be it legal or medical or websites or whatever, how they usually expand or shrink. Here's an example that I found on the website of the W3C. They go with the first word, English views, and translated it into different other languages and show the rate of how much it expands. So you can see for Korean it shrinks, for Chinese it expands, sometimes it shrinks, it depends on what translation you're using. But you can see that from a single small word in English you can go to a huge word in another language. If it's more text, if it's like 2-3 lines of text, the expansion rates are usually not that big. There's another one that I found, and you can see from the date, it's from 1994. So even at that time, people were looking into these expansion things, but it's very, very general what they do here, and it's mostly geared towards software at that point. But here are some for text. One is really going from English and to English, so you have the different languages from English to that language, and from that language into English. But as you can see in Chinese, it says it varies. So it varies so much that you can't really have something, an average, where you say that's usually how it goes. So feel free to do your own tests, because these lists are just an indication of how things probably are, not how they are for the documents and the languages that you are working with. Now here's a tip for those who are doing pseudo-translation into different languages, like with multilingual projects or as a translator if you're working with different target languages. You can set them up all in one dialog. So basically what I've done here, I've set up it's English to, no, I have to take my glasses, it's too small here. So English into Greek, because memoQ offers you to select the script that you want to show as pseudo-translation. So it could be Greek or Russian or Chinese or Japanese or Latin-based. and then you just select the languages that you want to use it for, select the scripts for these languages, and it will give you an example of how the text will look like. And then if you have a second language pair that you want to deal with, you just create a second setup. In this case, English to Japanese, although what I see here is in Japanese, that doesn't really look Japanese. I think we'll have to talk to the developers. In Japanese, you have a lot more hiragana, katakana, not that many kanji, but at least you can see it expands because the characters are broader. That can be done when you uncheck the box for the change of the characters that memoQ has already set. So then you can set these default settings for the scripts, or you can check the box and just put in your own line of characters that you want to see instead of the characters of the source language. To run the pseudo-translation, you use the pre-translation feature. You switch on the machine translation checkbox and then go to the link and select the pseudo-translation plugin for the languages that you want to use it for. It has to be set up for the languages in your project, otherwise it will not run. So if you don't have all the languages set up in your pseudo-translation dialog, you might not see the pseudo-translation. It's a little bit tricky sometimes to set it up correctly. But what you get afterwards is something into a Latin-based language using all the accented characters that memoQ can get a hold of. Something in Greek. Here is the Japanese again. They also have something for Arabic. So you can sort of see how the document would look like. The text doesn't make sense. It's just gibberish. Another special use case that they have in their settings is that you can join words to simulate languages that use compound words, like German, like Dutch and Finnish. So there's a setting where you can then make longer words. This could be useful if you later on see the document in its native layout to see whether you need to put in automatic hyphenation or if that looks odd when you have these longer words. You can also go the other way around. You can also split up the words into a lot of smaller words. I'm not sure that makes any sense because what conclusion would you draw from that? But as you can join the words, they also put in that you can split the words. Now, that one special use case that I'm using quite a lot is when I create my filters and I want to see whether everything has been extracted. So I'm checking my import filter by running a pseudo-translation and changing all the characters of the source text into underscores or dots, or something that you can easily overlook so that you can then pinpoint the parts where there really is still text. So I've run it on one of my sample XML training files, and I found, okay, there are segments that have not been touched by the pseudo-translation. In this case, it's okay because I excluded that tag from translation, but further down I see some text where I find, oh, I forgot to make the value of this tag translatable. So this is really good for any type of text-based file format, JSON files, XML files, anything where you have to make sure that a certain key or a certain tag and the text in between is translated or not. What I would recommend, or what I see some of my clients do, is that they add pseudo-translation in their templates. So they create a dedicated project for pseudo-translation, run the files through it, so import the documents, they get run through pseudo-translation, they get exported automatically, so that you then can check the files whether they need preparation or not. If necessary, prepare the files, import them to the real project. Now, of course, this is a lot of extra work. You have an extra project that you need to run it through. You could also do a little bit of scripting in, or search and replace, basically. You have this template for the project for your client. You import the file, automatically run the pseudo-translation. Automatically export the file so that you can check them. Run a search and replace script with the find and replace tool that comes with memoQ. And I'll be talking about the scripting tomorrow. That actually deletes the pseudo-translated content from your file. So the file is just fresh as it would be if you imported it the first time. Then if preparation is necessary, you can do the preparation, do a re-import on top of the file in your project. And if not, if no preparation is necessary, you can just use the file as it is right now in the project without having to go in manually and deleting the pseudo-translated part. So that's automation that is possible with memoQ. And I think that's about it, what I wanted to tell you about pseudo-translation. Now, do we still have time for questions? We do. We do have time for questions. No questions. You have a question? Oh, there. Yes, sure. Yeah, that's a good idea. I've also seen it when people have to check whether a workflow works, like going from WordPress through automated action into memoQ, going back, and whether that works and really shows up and everything is translated. Pseudo-translation can help there as well. That's a good question. You can, of course, you can use MT, but you're missing out on some of the features that pseudo-translation gives you, like setting up the character at the beginning and at the end. And also I found that if you have text that is really readable, understandable, you don't focus on the things that you want to focus on, the layout, the overlapping of text and images, because everything looks nice. It's just like AI. It looks nice and you don't look deeper and there are still mistakes. So I would rather do pseudo-translation so that you're not distracted by the actual text from what you're really looking at, like formatting and layout and things like that. Not really. If you know that, well, if you get XML files, doesn't make sense to do pseudo-translation unless the client wants to do a test import and see how the files come up later on. But for files that do have a layout, like Word, PowerPoint, InDesign, Excel, maybe HTML as well, I would definitely recommend it. PowerPoint, I think, is one of the most use case or most useful thing to do to a PowerPoint presentation, because you have so many things that in PowerPoint can go wrong or are not extracted, and then you have a lot of work afterwards. And just remember those 26 languages that you have to go into. You don't want to check 26 40-slide presentations until tomorrow.